your voice silenced, and soldiers patrolling your streets not during war, but in your own homeland. This isn't a scene from a movie, it's the real story of Myanmar, a nation where the struggle for freedom has been written in courage, pain, and resilience for decades. Myanmar's military foundations trace back to the British colonial era, which began in the 19th century when Burma was annexed into British India. Under British rule, administrative divisions deepened ethnic divides by favoring certain minority groups like the Karen and Kachin for military recruitment, while the majority Burma population was largely excluded from such positions. This colonial policy planted long-term mistrust and competition among ethnic groups. When Burma moved toward independence after World War II, many of these ethnic communities feared Burma domination and demanded autonomy. At the same time, the anti-fascist People's Freedom League (AFPFL), led by General Aung San, negotiated Burma's independence in 1947. However, Aung San's assassination before independence in 1948 left the country politically vulnerable and unstable. To maintain order, the Burmese army, later known as the Tatmadaw, began asserting increasing control over state matters. Internal rebellions from ethnic groups and communist insurgents gave the military justification to expand its influence. The army saw itself not just as a defense force, but as the guardian of national unity and sovereignty. In this mindset, political parties and democratic processes were often viewed as threats to stability. The military's role grew stronger after the 1958 caretaker government, when General Ne Win was temporarily given power to calm political unrest. That experiment in military rule laid the groundwork for the 1962 coup, which made military dominance permanent. British colonial strategies had inadvertently created a fractured society, and the post-independence government lacked the capacity to bridge these divides. The Tatmadaw took advantage of the situation to position itself as the ultimate authority capable of preserving order. The early years of independence, marked by ethnic conflicts and political instability, solidified the military's perception that only it could keep the country unified even at the cost of democracy. In 1962, General Ne Win led a military coup that abruptly ended Myanmar's brief experiment with parliamentary democracy. The coup came at a time when the country was struggling with political instability, ethnic tensions, and fears of national fragmentation. The ruling anti-fascist People's Freedom League, AFPFL, had splintered into rival factions, and ethnic minority groups were pushing for federal autonomy, which alarmed the central government and military leadership. The immediate trigger was the proposal for a federal constitution that might have granted greater rights to ethnic states. The military interpreted this as a threat to national unity and feared the possible disintegration of the country. General Ne Win, who had briefly taken power during a caretaker military government from 1958 to 1960, justified the coup by declaring the need to preserve the Union and protect the country from chaos. On March 2, 1962, the military swiftly seized control, arresting Prime Minister U Nu, key ministers, and ethnic leaders. They dissolved the existing constitution and banned all political parties. A new military-led government was established under the Revolutionary Council, with Ne Win as its chairman. Soon after, Ne Win introduced the Burmese way to socialism, an ideology that blended military authoritarianism with isolationist economic policies and strict state control. This led to the nationalization of industries, expulsion of foreign businesses, censorship of media, and suppression of political dissent. Universities were closed, student protests were crushed, and a one-party system under the Burma Socialist Program Party was installed. Ethnic insurgencies intensified, and the military's power became deeply embedded in every sector of society. The 1962 coup did not just change the leadership, it fundamentally altered the direction of the nation, placing the military at the core of governance, economy, and identity for decades to come. Myanmar's ethnic conflicts and civil wars are among the longest-running in the world. Deeply rooted in the country's colonial past and post-independence power struggles, with over 135 recognized ethnic groups, Myanmar is a highly diverse nation. Yet the central government, dominated by the Bamar majority, has historically failed to integrate this diversity into a unified political framework. When the country gained independence in 1948, several ethnic groups, including the Karen, Kachin, Shan, and Mon, had hoped for federalism or greater autonomy, as promised during the Panglong Agreement negotiated by General Aung San. However, those promises were not fulfilled, and disillusioned ethnic minorities began forming armed groups to demand self-determination. The Tatmadaw, or Myanmar military, responded to these demands with heavy-handed military campaigns. These operations often involved scorched earth tactics, forced relocations, village burnings, and civilian casualties, which further fueled resentment and insurgency. Armed ethnic organizations like the Karen National Union, KNU, Kachin Independence, Army Kia, and Shan State Army, SSA, engaged in protracted guerrilla warfare against the state, controlling territories in border regions. Many of these conflicts were financed through control of natural resources like jade, timber, and opium. Creating a complex economy of war, successive military governments refused meaningful political dialogue, choosing instead to maintain control through force. Ceasefire agreements signed during the 1990s and 2000s often lacked political solutions and were frequently broken. In some cases, ceasefires allowed the military to expand infrastructure and influence in ethnic areas under the guise of peace. Even after limited democratic reforms in the 2010s, deep mistrust persisted. The 2021 military coup reignited fighting in many regions, as ethnic armed groups resumed hostilities in support of the broader anti-junta resistance. These overlapping conflicts have created a cycle of violence that continues to destabilize the country and prevent lasting peace. The 1988 uprising in Myanmar, also known as the 8888 Uprising, was a major nationwide movement demanding democracy. Sparked by years of economic mismanagement, repression, and military rule under General Ne Win, the country's economy had collapsed. Due to Ne Win's isolationist policies and the disastrous implementation of the Burmese way to socialism, a sudden demonetization of currency in September 1987 wiped out people's savings, leading to mass frustration, especially among students and the urban poor. Protests began in March 1988 when a student in Yangon was killed during a fight with government-backed individuals. Triggering outrage across campuses, student-led demonstrations quickly spread from universities to the streets, with thousands joining in to protest government corruption, lack of freedom, and economic hardship. By August 1988, the movement reached its peak with hundreds of thousands of people, monks, students, workers, civil servants, and even police demanding an end to military rule. On August 8, a massive protest erupted across the country. The date, the 8th of August 88, became symbolic, marking a day when the people rose together in unity and hope. The military's response was brutal. Troops opened fire on unarmed protesters in Yangon and other cities, killing thousands within days. Hospitals were overwhelmed, bodies were taken away in trucks, and many families were never informed about the fate of their loved ones. The crackdown was swift and unforgiving. On September 18, 1988, the military officially retook control by forming the State Law and Order Restoration Council (SLORC), abolishing any remaining democratic institutions and suspending civil liberties. Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of national hero Aung San, emerged during this time as a leading figure for democracy. However, the violent repression of 1988 left a deep scar on the national psyche and reaffirmed the military's grip on power for decades to come. The Rohingya crisis of 2016 to 2017 marked one of the darkest chapters in Myanmar's modern history. Characterized by a brutal military campaign against the Rohingya Muslim minority in Rakhine State, the Rohingya, who have lived in Myanmar for generations, have long faced systemic discrimination. Denied citizenship under the 1982 citizenship law, and labeled as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, despite deep roots in the region. Tensions between the Rohingya and the Buddhist Rakhine population had existed for decades. often fueled by state-sponsored narratives that painted the Rohingya as outsiders and security threats. In October 2016, a militant group known as the Rohingya Salvation Army ASA attacked several police posts, prompting a military response. The Tatmadaw launched sweeping clearance operations across Rohingya villages, which intensified dramatically after a second wave of attacks by RSA in August 2017. What followed was a campaign of extreme violence. Entire villages were burned to the ground, civilians were executed, women were raped, and children were killed. Survivors recounted horrors of mass killings and watching family members slaughtered before fleeing on foot to neighboring Bangladesh. Within weeks, over 700,000 Rohingya fled across the border, joining hundreds of thousands who had escaped earlier waves of violence. Refugee camps like Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh became overcrowded, shelters for traumatized communities with little hope of return. The United Nations and international human rights organizations described the campaign as ethnic cleansing and possible genocide. Despite global condemnation, the Myanmar government, including de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi, denied wrongdoing, claiming it was a counter-terrorism operation. Journalists and investigators were blocked, and efforts for justice were met with resistance. The crisis not only exposed the depth of Myanmar's ethnic divisions, but also marked a severe blow to its fragile democratic reputation on the world stage. On February 1, 2021, Myanmar's military, known as the Tatmadaw, seized power in a coup d'etat, detaining civilian leaders including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint. The coup came just hours before the newly elected parliament was set to convene, following the National League for Democracy's (NLD) landslide victory in the November 2020 general election. The military claimed widespread election fraud without evidence and declared a one-year state of emergency, returning Myanmar to full military rule after a decade of partial civilian governance. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of citizens took to the streets in what became known as the Spring Revolution. Peaceful protests erupted in every major city and town, involving workers, students, monks, doctors, teachers, and civil servants. A mass civil disobedience movement paralyzed government functions, and people demanded the release of detained leaders and the restoration of democracy. The military responded with increasing violence, using live ammunition, water cannons, and arrests to suppress dissent. Thousands were killed, wounded, or imprisoned as the crackdown intensified. Amid the brutality, many protesters turned to armed resistance. New defense forces, known as the People's Defense Force (PDF), formed across the country, particularly in urban and central regions where armed conflict had not previously existed. Ethnic armed organizations, long in conflict with the military, also intensified their campaigns and, in some cases, aligned with the PDF against the common enemy. The opposition formed the National Unity Government (NUG), a shadow government operating in exile, seeking international recognition and support. The coup reignited decades-old civil wars and fractured the country into zones of control, with resistance forces governing some areas. As of today, the conflict remains unresolved, turning Myanmar into a battlefield between authoritarian rule and a grassroots movement for democratic freedom. Myanmar's history of military conflict is a painful journey, marked by lost hopes, broken promises, and the courage of countless people who stood up in the face of fear. From the legacy of colonial rule to the 1962 coup, from decades of civil war and ethnic persecution to the brutal suppression of peaceful uprisings, and from the horror of the Rohingya crisis to the fierce resistance following the 2021 coup, this is a nation that has endured unimaginable struggle. Yet in the face of every crackdown, there have been voices that refused to be silenced, hands that reached out to help, and hearts that continued to dream of peace. The people of Myanmar have shown that even when darkness falls, the desire for justice, dignity, and freedom does not disappear. It remains alive in every protest, every act of defiance. and every hope for a future where all people can live in safety, equality, and truth.